The night is quiet, too quiet. In the distance, a faint wind pushes through the tall grass, carrying with it the smell of smoke. It is not the smoke of a hearth fire warming a family, nor the smoke of farmland being cleared for crops. This is darker, acrid. It is the smoke of war, of something that will forever alter the fate of a continent. Imagine a single day, a single morning when a river of blood decides the course of nations yet unborn. What if history itself could be traced back to one brutal choice? What if everything we know about America, its rise, its promise, its contradictions, was born not in speeches or documents, but in fire and steel under the cover of night? For 10 days in American history, the world seemed to turn on its head. Days when ordinary people woke to what felt like the usual, feeding children, tending fields, fetching water, only to find that by nightfall, nothing would ever be the same again. 10 days that were not planned as turning points, but instead ambushed the future. The first of those days came long before independence, before the Constitution, even before the colonies had an identity. It began with a dawn raid, a massacre so ferocious it shocked even its perpetrators and set the pattern for how a new nation would deal with those who lived on this land first. The year is 1637, the place, the edge of the Mystic River in the heart of New England. To some, it was a place of survival, with its thick forests, its flowing waters, its fertile earth. To others, it was home for centuries. The Pequot people, whose villages dotted the land, whose lives followed the rhythm of seasons and the cycles of the hunt. But to a group of anxious settlers from across the ocean, it was land to be claimed, a frontier to be subdued. And that tension, ancient presence colliding with foreign ambition, was about to ignite in a single, unforgettable morning. The English colonists had come only 2 decades earlier, fragile, dependent, barely surviving their first winters. The Pequots had seen it before, strangers arriving on ships, bargaining for trade, pleading for food, sometimes bringing new tools, sometimes bringing disease. But by the late 1630s, the fragile balance had broken. Both sides accused the other of treachery. Colonists whispered of raids on farms. Native leaders spoke of deceitful treaties. And between them lay fear. Fear sharpened into the language of survival. The English saw themselves surrounded by hostile tribes, hemmed in on a land they barely understood. The Pequots saw invaders whose numbers grew with each ship, whose hunger for land seemed endless, whose diseases already decimated their kin. It was no longer a question of if violence would erupt, but when. That day came on May 26, 1637. A coalition of Puritan settlers, aided by their native allies, Mohegan and Narragansett tribes, enemies of the Pequots, marched silently toward the Pequot fort at Mystic. Their leader, Captain John Mason, believed this was not a skirmish for survival, but a holy war. To his Puritan followers, the Pequots were not simply rivals, they were obstacles to God's divine mission in the New World. And as the militia crept through the forest in the hours before sunrise, torches hidden, muskets primed, they carried with them not just weapons, but a vision that this land, soaked in blood, could one day be theirs.
Inside the fort, life went on as it had for generations. Women prepared meals, children slept beside their families. Warriors rested after days of watchfulness. The Pequot had heard rumors of English hostility, but did not expect an assault of this scale. Not here, not now. To them, Mystic was strong, a palisaded village fortified with wooden walls and defended by warriors who knew every tree and every trail. But no wall, no spear, no shield could prepare them for what was about to unfold. As the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the English stormed the fort. Muskets cracked, arrows flew, shouts split the morning air. The Pequots, startled but fierce, fought back with everything they had. But Mason's men had planned more than battle. They had planned annihilation. Torches were flung, thatched roofs caught fire, and within minutes the village was an inferno. Flames devoured the walls, smoke suffocated the air, sparks fell on the terrified faces of women and children trying to flee. Some were cut down at the gates, others burned alive in their homes. The cries of the dying mixed with the roars of fire and the thunder of muskets. It was not a fight. It was a slaughter.
By the time the smoke cleared, somewhere between 400 and 700 Pequot men, women, and children lay dead. Less than a handful of English soldiers were killed. The imbalance was staggering. The Allies who had joined the Puritans, the Narragansett in particular, were horrified. They had expected battle, perhaps even victory, but not this. Not the wholesale slaughter of a village, the screams of children in the flames. One witness later recalled them crying out, "It is too much, too much." But for Mason and his men, it was not too much. It was exactly enough. Enough to break the Pequots as a power. Enough to send a message that resistance meant extermination. Enough to ensure that from this day forward, the rules of war in the New World would be written in fire. The massacre at Mystic was more than a battle. It was a template. It was the first time colonists in New England had chosen total destruction as a strategy, not merely victory. And it set the tone for centuries to come. Treaties broken when convenient, wars justified by divine mission, and the steady march of settlers across a continent at any cost. On that morning, as the ashes of Mystic cooled, the future was being carved into the land with blood and smoke. It was one day, one massacre, one choice, and yet it changed America forever. The smoke over Mystic had barely cooled when the world began reshaping itself again. A century and a half later, the colonies had broken free from Britain, fought their revolution, and declared themselves a nation. But freedom on parchment is fragile. The young United States was not yet a country in any secure sense. It was a patchwork of jealous states, burdened by debt, fearful of standing armies, and simmering with anger from the very farmers who had fought to win independence. The world had celebrated their victory against the crown, but few realized that the greatest threat to America's survival was not Britain's return, it was America itself. The year is 1787, deep in the heart of Massachusetts. Fields lie barren after years of war, deaths are crushing, and courts are seizing farms from men who once shouldered muskets for liberty. Among them is Daniel Shays, a poor farmer, a veteran of Bunker Hill and Saratoga. He and men like him had given everything for the Revolution, only to come home and find that their freedom had purchased them poverty. And as judges seized land, as sheriffs sold livestock, as lawyers demanded payments in coin that farmers did not have, desperation turned to fury. For Shays and thousands of farmers like him, this was not the America they had fought for. This was tyranny reborn in a new uniform.
They gathered first in whispers, then in crowds. Farmers marched on local courthouses, shutting them down with sheer numbers, preventing foreclosures by force. Muskets were slung over shoulders, not as threats, but as statements. We fought once for liberty, and we will fight again if needed. Shays emerged as a reluctant leader, driven less by ambition than by outrage. He was no aristocrat, no polished politician. He was one of them. His rebellion was not against America, but against the betrayal of its promise. Yet to the men in Boston, to the wealthy creditors and politicians who had the ears of state government, it was sedition. It was mob rule. It was the revolution threatening to devour itself. By January of 1787, the confrontation reached a breaking point. Shays and hundreds of his men marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield, hoping to seize weapons and spark a broader uprising. But waiting for them were state militia, cannon loaded and aimed. The snow crunched under boots as the farmers advanced, ragged but determined. Then thunder. Grape shot tore through the rebel ranks, men fell screaming, and chaos scattered the rest. The rebellion was crushed not by negotiation, but by firepower. Daniel Shays barely escaped with his life. The rebellion failed, but its shockwaves were enormous. To George Washington and other national leaders, it was a warning siren. If the Republic could be threatened by its own farmers, if the Articles of Confederation left the federal government powerless to quell unrest, then the experiment of liberty might collapse before it began. Out of that fear, out of the ashes of Shays' rebellion, came the Constitutional Convention. The United States Constitution, the framework of all that followed, was drafted in part because of the terror that ordinary men with muskets could topple the fragile order. In the snow at Springfield, America had nearly torn itself apart, and in Philadelphia, leaders decided they would never let that happen again.
If Shays' rebellion revealed the fragility of the Republic, the next great turning point revealed the intoxication of possibility. Less than a century later, the nation was no longer fragile, it was ravenous. Its population surged westward, hungry for land, for fortune, for destiny. And then, in the foothills of California in 1848, a single discovery lit a fuse that would explode across the continent. It was January at Sutter's Mill, a sawmill along the American River. James Marshall, a carpenter, bent down to examine a glittering flake in the streambed. He lifted it between his fingers, tested it against stone. It was soft, it was bright, it was gold. What he found that morning seemed small, insignificant, a few flakes in the water, but the rumor of it spread like wildfire. Within weeks, whispers turned to shouts, shouts to stampedes. The word gold rang through taverns, newspapers, and ship stocks. And then, America moved.
The California gold rush was not just migration, it was mania. Men abandoned farms, shops, even families, and rushed west. Ships clogged San Francisco Bay. Covered wagons wound through deserts and mountains. By 1849, tens of thousands poured into California, transforming a remote frontier into the epicenter of American dreams. They came with shovels, pans, picks, and desperation. Most found nothing but hardship. A few struck it rich beyond imagination. And beneath it all lay a deeper story. America was revealing its character. The promise of sudden wealth, the willingness to gamble everything, the hunger to expand no matter the cost. This was not just a gold rush. This was America's rush toward destiny. Yet destiny has a price. The rush devastated native lands, poisoned rivers, and unleashed violence between prospectors, immigrants, and indigenous people. Chinese laborers arrived in droves, only to face brutal discrimination. Vigilante justice ruled mining towns, where fortunes changed hands at the edge of a pistol. For the nation, gold filled the treasury, powered industry, and accelerated California's statehood. But for many who went, it was a fever dream, a chase after glitter that left only dust. Still, the gold rush carved itself into the American imagination. It became myth, the belief that with courage or luck or sheer will, anyone could seize fortune overnight. That myth would shape everything that followed, from industry to Wall Street to Silicon Valley. And it began with a sparkle in a stream at Sutter Mills.
The sun rises over Maryland on September 17, 1862, but it does not rise on peace.
The Civil War is raging, and the nation's fate is balanced on a knife's edge. Union and Confederate armies face each other near a small creek called Antietam. The rolling hills, cornfields, and stone bridges of this quiet countryside are about to become the stage for the bloodiest single day in American history. Soldiers on both sides wake to the sound of bugles and drums, their breaths hanging in the cool dawn air, knowing that by nightfall, thousands of them will be gone. They march not for glory, not for plunder, but because their leaders have demanded it. And as the first volleys crack across the misty fields, America begins one of its darkest days. At Antietam, war becomes slaughter. Union lines advance through cornfields so dense with smoke and gunfire that stalks are shredded like paper. Confederate defenders fight with ferocity, their cannons tearing gaps in the blue ranks. The Dunker Church, a simple white structure, becomes a marker in a killing field where neither side yields an inch. At Bloody Lane, soldiers fire until the dead are piled so high the living use them as cover. At Burnside's Bridge, wave after wave of Union troops throw themselves against dug-in Confederates, the creek running red beneath them. By nightfall, the ground is soaked with the blood of more than 23,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. Never before, and never again, would America see such carnage in a single day. For Abraham Lincoln, Antietam was more than a battlefield. It was an opportunity. The war had dragged on, Europe watched closely, and the Union needed a victory, or at least the appearance of one. Antietam was not a clear triumph. Lee's army was battered, but not destroyed. Yet Lincoln seized the moment. With the Confederate advance stopped, he unveiled a proclamation he had been holding back, the Emancipation Proclamation. By tying the Union cause to the abolition of slavery, Lincoln transformed the war. No longer was it only about preserving the Union, it became a fight for freedom, a moral crusade that changed America's soul. But it had come at the cost of a river of blood. Antietam was a day of horror, but also a pivot. It showed the world that America was willing to sacrifice everything, even tens of thousands of lives in a single sunrise to sunset inferno, for the survival of its experiment in liberty. And in that pivot, the nation redefined itself, not just in who would be free, but in what it was willing to endure for that freedom. The fields of Maryland became a grave and also a forge.
Decades later, another war loomed, not on cornfields, but across oceans, in laboratories, and inside the minds of men. In 1939, Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Adolf Hitler's Germany had swallowed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and now Poland was under siege. Refugees fled, and among them were some of the greatest minds in science, physicists who saw the storm gathering. They also saw something else, the possibility that science itself could decide the war and the fate of the world. Albert Einstein, already world famous for his theory of relativity, lived quietly on Long Island. But his colleague, physicist Leo Szilard, carried a terrifying idea that uranium, split in just the right way, could unleash an explosion unlike anything seen before. Rumors spread that German scientists were racing to unlock that secret. If Hitler got the bomb first, the world would be his. Something had to be done. Szilard, with Einstein's prestige, drafted a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. In calm, precise words,
It warned that Germany might be building a weapon of unimaginable power. It urged the United States to act, to research, to prepare. Einstein signed it in August 1939, and with that signature, history shifted.
The letter reached Roosevelt, who created the Advisory Committee on Uranium. What followed grew into the Manhattan Project, a vast secret program that harnessed the brightest scientific minds and billions of dollars to build the first atomic bomb. From a quiet letter came mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War and the nuclear age. Einstein later regretted his role, saying he wished he had never signed. But the truth is inescapable. That single day, that single letter, opened a door that could never be closed. If Antietam showed how much America would bleed to redefine itself, Einstein's letter showed how much power America could wield to defend itself. Both days revealed something terrifying and awe-inspiring, that America's destiny was not just shaped on battlefields, but also in words, in ideas, in choices made in shadows. A creek in Maryland, a cottage in Long Island, both changed the world forever.
The summer sun blazes over Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. It is a small town, quiet, where life moves at the pace of church bells and courthouse steps. But in July, the world turns its eyes here. The sidewalks swell with reporters, preachers, vendors, and curiosity seekers. Dayton is no longer just a town. It has become a stage. On trial is not merely a young school teacher named John Scopes, but an idea: evolution. The question is simple. Should students be allowed to learn that man descended from apes, or must they only be taught that God created man as written in Genesis? It is science versus scripture, modernity versus tradition, and America holds its breath. The courthouse becomes a furnace of rhetoric. On one side, William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate and fiery defender of biblical faith, his booming voice echoing with certainty. On the other, Clarence Darrow, the famed defense attorney, sharp as a blade, relentless in cross-examination. The trial draws thousands. Spectators crowd windows, climb telephone poles, press against walls. Radios carry their words across the country. The first trial broadcast nationwide. And in this heat-soaked courtroom, America sees itself torn in two. The Scopes trial is not really about one teacher. It is about a nation wrestling with change, with fear, with the collision of old belief and new knowledge.
When Darrow calls Bryan to the stand, the trial explodes into theater. Darrow, agnostic and cunning, presses Bryan on biblical literalism. Could Jonah really live inside a whale? Did the world truly form in 6 days? Bryan defends with passion, but under Darrow's questions, he falters. The crowd leans in. The nation listens as the battle of faith and reason plays out in real time. In the end, Scopes is found guilty, fined a mere $100, but the verdict is almost irrelevant. What mattered was the spectacle, the confrontation. The Scopes trial exposed a divide that still haunts America between faith and science, tradition and progress. One July week in Tennessee became a mirror in which a nation saw its deepest struggle.
3 decades later, the battle is no longer in a courtroom. It is in the dark fields of Mississippi, where a boy's laughter and innocence collide with the raw brutality of hatred. His name is Emmett Till, 14 years old, visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi, during the summer of 1955. He is young, playful, a city boy from Chicago. He does not know the weight of Jim Crow, the invisible lines drawn by terror and tradition. One afternoon, in a small grocery store, he is accused of whistling at a white woman. That whistle, or what people believed they heard, sealed his fate. Days later, Emmett is kidnapped by the woman's husband and his half-brother. He is beaten, tortured, shot. His body is dumped in the Tallahatchie River, weighted with a cotton gin fan. When his corpse is found, it is unrecognizable, swollen, disfigured beyond recognition. But his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, makes a choice that will shake the conscience of the world. She insists on an open casket funeral in Chicago. "I wanted the world to see what they did to my boy," she says. And the world does see. Jet magazine publishes photographs. Millions stare at the mutilated face of a child, and something inside America cracks. In Mississippi, an all-white jury acquits the killers after barely an hour of deliberation. They even smile for photographs afterward, knowing they are untouchable. But their smug victory is hollow. Emmett Till's death does not silence fear, it ignites fury. The pictures of his face burn into America's conscience, especially among young black activists. Rosa Parks would later say that when she refused to give up her bus seat, she thought of Emmett Till. His lynching became a spark, and from that spark grew a fire, the civil rights movement. A boy's laughter, a whistle in a grocery store, a coffin left open, all converged into one of the most powerful catalysts in American history. The Scopes trial showed America divided over truth. Emmett Till's murder showed America divided over humanity. Both days revealed not just moments in time, but wounds that run deep, shaping the battles yet to come. One took place in a courtroom, the other in a cotton field. Yet both demanded the same question: what kind of nation would America choose to be? The summer of 1964 in Mississippi burned with more than heat. For generations, black citizens had been denied the most basic right of democracy, the vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and outright violence had silenced them. But now, a movement rose to challenge that silence. Hundreds of young volunteers, many white and from northern states, poured into Mississippi for what became known as Freedom Summer. Their mission was simple but dangerous: register black voters, teach in freedom schools, and shine a spotlight on the brutality of segregation. They carried clipboards and books, not guns, but they walked into a war zone all the same. The volunteers knew the risks. Mississippi's white establishment was furious, and the Ku Klux Klan was ready to strike. Within days of the project's beginning, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, vanished. Their burned-out car was found in the woods. Weeks later, their bodies were discovered buried in an earthen dam, beaten and shot. The murders horrified the nation. For many Americans, the blood of those 3 young men forced a reckoning. This was not just about the South. This was about America itself. Could a nation that preached liberty allow terror to choke its own citizens at the ballot box? Despite the terror, Freedom Summer pressed on. Volunteers opened freedom schools, where children learned history and hope. Black citizens lined up to register, even as sheriffs and mobs glared. The work was slow, dangerous, and often heartbreaking, but it drew national attention. Cameras captured the faces of ordinary people demanding dignity. And in Washington, lawmakers could no longer look away. Freedom's summer sacrifice paved the way for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most important laws in American history. Mississippi had been a graveyard of dreams, but in that graveyard, seeds of change were planted. Freedom Summer was one of those days when courage was measured not in battles won, but in risks taken. Young men and women faced hatred armed only with faith and resolve. And in their courage, America moved closer to its ideals. It was proof that history turns not only on presidents and generals, but on ordinary people willing to risk everything for justice.
But if the 1960s tested America's soul at home, the late 1970s would test its power abroad. The setting was not Mississippi, but Tehran, Iran, a city seething with revolution. The Shah, long supported by the United States, had been overthrown. Ayatollah Khomeini's followers filled the streets, chanting against America, against imperialism, against decades of interference. On November 4, 1979, a crowd surged toward the U.S. Embassy. They were students, but behind them surged the force of a nation in upheaval. The embassy gates fell, and with them, America's sense of invulnerability. Dozens of Americans were taken hostage. Diplomats, staff, Marines. Blindfolded, bound, paraded through jeering crowds, they were suddenly pawns in a storm of history. The world watched as nightly news broadcasts opened with one grim refrain: Day 1, Day 2, Day 100. For 444 days, America lived with the humiliation. President Jimmy Carter struggled, torn between diplomacy and military force. A rescue mission failed disastrously in the desert, helicopters burning in the sand. The images were seared into the nation's mind, a superpower, humbled and helpless.
The hostage crisis was more than a standoff. It was a turning point. It reshaped American foreign policy, hardened attitudes toward Iran, and destroyed Carter's presidency. It helped sweep Ronald Reagan into office, promising strength and renewal. And it left scars that endure to this day. The chants of "Death to America," the blindfolded faces of hostages, the endless countdown on evening news, they revealed a new era in which America's power would be challenged not just by armies, but by ideologies, by revolution, by rage on foreign streets. Like Freedom Summer, the hostage crisis forced America to face itself, its promises, its limits, its vulnerabilities. One tested whether America could deliver justice at home, the other whether it could protect its standing abroad. Together, they were reminders that history changes not just in triumphs, but in trials. The morning of September 11, 2001, dawned clear and blue over New York City. The sky was flawless, the air crisp, the kind of day where the ordinary feels eternal. Commuters hurried through subway stations. Office workers filled elevators. Planes took off from crowded runways. Nothing in those first golden rays suggested history was about to turn. But in the span of just a few hours, the world would change. Not gradually, not subtly, but with fire, steel, and terror that seared itself into the memory of a generation. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Cameras turned skyward. Confused faces stared upward at the black smoke pouring from the glass and steel. At first, many thought it was a tragic accident. But at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower, erupting into flames. There was no doubt now. America was under attack. Across the nation, televisions flickered with disbelief. In the streets of Manhattan, panic surged.
Sirens screamed as firefighters and police raced into the towers, climbing upward as thousands tried to escape downward. And then, at 9:37 a.m., the Pentagon was struck. At 10:03, Flight 93 went down in a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. By then, the towers themselves were collapsing in clouds of ash and horror.
The images were apocalyptic. People running through ash-choked streets as towers fell, survivors covered in gray dust, firefighters digging with bare hands through twisted steel. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost that day. Fathers, mothers, children, friends, strangers whose only crime was to begin a normal morning. America had faced attacks before, but never like this. The nation's sense of safety, of invulnerability, shattered in an instant. It was not just an attack on buildings, or even on people. It was an attack on the idea of America itself, on its confidence that oceans could protect, that power could shield. In the days that followed, grief mingled with resolve. Candlelight vigils glowed across the world. Congress gathered on the Capitol steps to sing "God Bless America." President George W. Bush, standing amid the rubble with a bullhorn, declared that the world would hear America's response. And they did. The wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq, the rise of the security state, the endless debates about liberty and safety, all flowed from that one morning. Like Antietam, like Freedom Summer, like Mystic, 9/11 was a day that carved itself into history. A wound and a turning.
10 days. 10 moments when America stood at a crossroads, often without knowing it. From the massacre at Mystic to the smoking ruins of Manhattan, each day was different. Some violent, some quiet, some hidden in letters or whispered in classrooms. Yet together, they tell a story. America is not a straight line, but a jagged path, forged in conflict, in courage, in mistakes, and in resilience. Each day was unexpected. Each left scars, but each also forced the nation to change. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, always forever. The story of America is not only in its triumphs, but in its trials. In bloodied fields, burning forts, shattered courtrooms, and grieving mothers, the future was born. And if history teaches anything, it is that the next turning point may come when we least expect it. The question is not whether there will be another day that changes everything. The question is whether we will be ready when it comes.